Japanese role-playing games became a major part of the video game mainstream since the advent of the first PlayStation. But JRPGs were already being introduced during the Nintendo and Sega wars of the 1990s. Now, this may be true, but the reception of JRPGs around the world differs. And I'm here to represent the Philippines. In this video editorial, we are going to do a retrospective of the JRPG scene in the Philippines before the PlayStation. Greetings everyone, my name is Nurse Joe. If you are new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and a link and subscribe to my channel. And please do not forget to hit that notification for more future content. Now in our previous video, we discussed about the influences of the 90s on why I've become a fan of the JRPG genre. Spoiler, anime and video games. However, in 1995, I had to put my gaming life in hiatus because I was prepping for high school. And even at that time, I was still completely oblivious on what the JRPG genre is. I only started playing JRPGs when I got my first PlayStation in 1998. But why is it that I haven't heard of the genre before? To answer that question, I'm going to need some help. I need another Filipino gamer who knows about video games, who knows JRPGs, and grew up in the 90s. Luckily, I know where to look.
This is the Facebook page of the Retro Gamers and Collectors of the Philippines, or RGCP. The members of this page specializes on buying, selling, and discussion of everything video games from Atari to Xbox. If there is a Filipino gamer who grew up in the 90s who knows about JRPGs, then this is the good place to look. Now, that being said, the people here are not the official experts or authorities in the subject, but they know their stuff and they take their stuff very seriously. So I made an open discussion about the influence of JRPGs in the Philippines during the 90s. The responses were instantaneous and overwhelming. Taking their opinions into consideration, I narrowed it down to 5 reasons why JRPGs did not stick to most Filipino gamers in the early 90s. The Philippines is a country in Southeast Asia, a mere 4-hour flight away from Japan. Nintendo would release the Famicom on July 15, 1983 in Japan, with the Philippines getting hold of the system 1 year later. In the West, America was still feeling the effects of the video game crash of 1983.
Will you be the one to experience the Nintendo Entertainment System?
Nintendo then would make a nationwide American release of the NES on September of 1986. Sega would challenge Nintendo by releasing the Mega Drive in Japan on 1988 and the Genesis in America on 1989. As part of Asia, the Philippines would get first pickings of the video games Nintendo and Sega have to offer. The Philippines uses 220 volts for electricity, so we needed a voltage regulator to play either of the Japanese and American versions of their system. The games were divided into categories: platformer, shooter, racing, fighting, beat 'em up, adventure, sports, and then role-playing. All but role-playing games would garner popularity among Filipino gamers back in the 90s, and the reasons on to why would keep on piling up. December 10, 1898. The Treaty of Paris was signed to end 3 centuries of Spanish rule over the Philippines. With this, America had sovereign control over the archipelago until 1946, before the Imperial Fleet of Japan occupied the Pacific after bombing Pearl Harbor. 4 decades of American rule meant teaching English as a primary language of the citizens of former Spanish colonies, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines. 2 centuries later, English became a secondary language of the Philippines to become globally recognized. Learning another language is just an option. As far as the gaming industry is concerned, Nintendo and Sega continue to butt heads for the Western market, as Nintendo of America and Sega of America did their best to release exclusives and localized games in their respective consoles. Filipino parents had to be careful on what they would buy for their children, not just because of the content quality. Famicom cartridges came in Japanese text for the cover, description, gameplay, and dialogue. Filipino gamers back then would have to import a localized English version of the game from America, assuming he has an NES and not a Famicom. JRPGs had a small following back before Final Fantasy VII propelled them to the mainstream. Even in the 80s, there's the so-called Big Three JRPGs, Phantasy Star, Dragon Quest, and Final Fantasy. As for me, I've never heard of them until I played Legend of Ligaya, and back when I first played it, I wasn't used to the usual mechanics of the genre. It was Final Fantasy IX that made me serious about the genre overall. That was back in third year high school. Benedict Villarreaza, RGCP, Quezon City. Enix released Dragon Quest I in Japan on 1996 for the Famicom, and it became a smash hit for the Japanese players. Unfortunately, it did not create the same buzz when it was localized for the NES in America on 1989. For us Filipino gamers, we got the Japanese version first. See where this is going? If everything is in Japanese, then one can see that a Filipino child would rather play something else. To dick ride the success of Dragon Quest, Square released their supposedly last video game. The Famicom would get the first Final Fantasy game in December 18, 1987. John Barely Cares adds, I spent so much on rental shops playing Dragon Quest I. I enjoyed the game better when I borrowed Nintendo Power magazine. My friend got lazy playing his NES, so I borrowed it to play Final Fantasy I. Because of the Japanese text in Final Fantasy VI, someone sold me his game for 300 pesos because he got stuck not knowing how Sabin's attack work. In 1990, it would be released for the NES with censorship limitations imposed by Nintendo of America. Not to be outdone, Sega released Phantasy Star 1 for the Master System in Japan, and it was released 2 days after Final Fantasy I was out for the Famicom. December 20, 1987. Phantasy Star 1 would be localized in the West in November of 1988. Since the Philippines got the Japanese versions first, only a few Filipino kids dared to play these games. It is the same as playing a video game in the dark. Sure, the game looks great, but nobody knows what the hell was going on. John Barely Cares adds, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were to name a few. I actually enjoyed Dragon Quest even though I was guessing the text. Nintendo's 8-bit system provided the Filipino gamers with so many classic games. Even the casual gamers, such as girls, can even learn how to play the basic game mechanics. Boys and girls alike come to enjoy the simple premise of how the game should be played. Jump on a platform, do not go over the edge. Shoot whoever comes your way, do not get hit by the enemy. If something is after you, do not get caught. If you are racing someone, always finish first. If people are punching you, beat the crap out of them. These kind of games were popular despite being played on the Famicom. I played with my siblings more than with friends. Our console back then was the Famicom, so we used to play games like Battle City, Galaga, Super Mario Bros., Duck Hunt, and Ice Climbers a lot. When the PS1 came, I only played a few JRPGs like Brigandine, Legend of Ligaya, Suikoden 1 and 2. We played mostly multiplayer games because my dad would chastise me if I played solo, haha. Marvin Season, RGCP, Bulacan. There were no dialogue or game tutorial in Japanese to know what you should do. The initial levels were pretty much practice stages where you learn the controls on your own. To finish one level to the next, you need to develop your skills, patience, strategy, and reaction time. Role-playing games need those elements as well. However, you need one more thing. The player needs to read. RPGs require the player to understand the depth of the game's overall story. This requires reading panels and panels of text to get a clue on what to do and where to go. So if a Filipino gamer should play an RPG on a Famicom during the 90s, then he better hire a translator. The internet in the Philippines will not be available until March 24 of 1994. I had a short attention span during the NES SNES era. Haha. I was not really into RPGs, only chose a few. Back then I loved action, fighting, run and gun, platformers, and shooters. A Link to the Past was the first game that I really strived to finish despite having a story and side quests. There was also Super Mario RPG. They eased me into JRPGs. Darwin Alcazar, RGCP, Antipolo. Siegfried Hans adds, I remembered the Japanese games Ys. English games were not available during those days, so I guessed on what to do. The original Famicom, when it was first released, was 14,800 yen in Japan. Convert that into Philippine peso, the Famicom would be around 7,000 to 8,000 pesos. Adjusted for inflation, that much was pretty expensive for a Filipino household in the 90s. Not every kid in the neighborhood had a Famicom or NES. Either your family is rich, or someone in your family bought it for you. Poverty may be a major problem in the Philippines, but it did not stop us. There were two ways you can enjoy video games during the 90s with so little money that we had. Either exchange your lunch money for tokens and spend it all at the video game arcade shops, or go to shops that rent out their Nintendo and Sega systems for 30 up to 60 minutes. RPGs back then were designed for console home gaming or handheld like the Game Boy. Darian Warwick adds more. RPGs, as you pointed out, found a cozy home in consoles due to how the game is played. Console owners, however, were very few in numbers, and its market can't even be remotely called extensive, as even in many developed places outside of Metro Manila, barely anyone sold them or even bought due to its price, which is expensive during its time. Not to mention that most RPG games were developed for home consoles during the time, and this meant requiring a TV to play. In an average home, you'd be lucky to even get a turn to use it for your playing an RPG game. Game Boy had popular titles like Pokemon, Final Fantasy, Secret of Mana, and Legend of Zelda. I started on the NES, but I didn't remember JRPGs being available at the time. When Game Boy was out, I really loved the Zelda game Link's Awakening, so I searched for other games like it. Pokemon Yellow being the closest one that I discovered. Those were my first JRPGs, but the genre got really big during the PS1 days. Squaresoft was the JRPG king back then. Rain Holero, RGCP, Tai. To play and finish a JRPG would require the player to invest time on this. Remember, the players were Filipino children who also need to study and go to school. Not to mention investing money, because original Famicom cartridges were not cheap. A Nintendo Famicom cartridge back then would range from 1,000 to 3,000 pesos. John Barely Cares adds more. Transfer of information was slow back then. Also, a SNES cartridge, even in English, was expensive. It would go for 3,000 pesos in 1990s money. The rental shops would never buy that. JRPGs were among the games which had the steepest price tags. Well, Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 first came out in the Famicom, so if you had it, you have a difficult time playing if you don't understand Japanese. We had RPGs like Dragon Quest and Legend of Zelda, but those games were more popular with kids who owned an NES, not a Famicom, unless you had a Honeybee converter. By the time the SNES and Genesis came out, peeps were more interested in action games or fighting games, especially when Street Fighter II was released on the SNES, followed by Mortal Kombat, and so on. And then you have the Dragon Ball Z games and Streets of Rage 2. I only know a few Pinoy peeps who took time to play Final Fantasy 2 and 4, and 3 and 6. 5 was only released in Japan at the time. Chrono Trigger or Secret of Mana. I owned a Genesis and my first JRPG experience was Phantasy Star 4, so that started my love for JRPGs. By the time I decided to buy a PS1, I knew what to expect with Final Fantasy VII, so it was a no-brainer for me to pick it up. Michael Sanchez, RGCP, Quezon City. Video games of the late 80s were programmed to be simple on their gameplay. Even if a player lost a life, it was no big deal to just hit reset and start over. Replayability was one of the reasons why the 8-bit systems were so great. Some games of the 90s, like Mega Man, were more time-consuming to finish. If for some miracle you were able to reach the last stage, there was still the risk of dying. Once you lose all of your lives, then you need to start over from the very beginning. And that can be frustrating as hell. A kid in general would never be allowed to play so late on a school night. And if you were a kid in the Philippines in the 90s, evening blackouts were rampant. Not because you forgot to pay your electric bills on time. Electricity got cut off because of some convoluted political sabotage against the Philippine government back then. Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda originally as a disc for the Famicom Disk System, launched on February 21, 1986. The disc has a lot more memory, so the player was allowed to write a game save file. This would then let the player continue where he left off. But the disk system did not translate well going to the West. Nintendo of America localized the game in cartridge form in 1988 for the NES. To remedy the game saving issue, they included an additional memory chip in the cart. A standard cartridge was expensive enough for Nintendo to make, so an additional chip for the complex games like Zelda would cost more, spiking the price tag. That was not a cost problem for Nintendo's first-party game titles, Mario and Zelda. It was a problem for third-party developers. So they tried to outsmart Nintendo. Some video game publishers would use passwords for every game level the player was able to pass through. These passwords bypassed the previous levels, plus letting the player keep the items he accumulated over time. As the 16-bit era arrived, Nintendo included the extra memory chips as part of their standard production for the Super Famicom in Japan and the Super NES in America. Since the capacity of the cart became larger, RPG developers expanded their programming. RPGs that were localized that gained commercial and critical success were Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Final Fantasy, Secret of Mana, Super Mario RPG, and Phantasy Star. Siegfried Hans adds, "For me, SNES popularities in JRPGs paved the way, and then followed by the PlayStation 1, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Ys, and the likes. Final Fantasy II, Final Fantasy III, Breath of Fire 3, 7 Saga, Lufia 1 and 2, Zelda, Super Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, Paladin's Quest, Arcana. There were other non-translated JRPGs in the SNES that I played, like the Shin Megami Tensei series." Jeffrey ng Licaros, RGCP, Manila. Darwin Alcazar writes, "There were many factors like time and priorities, perhaps. Maybe most people just did not like too much thinking when playing a game, like needing to understand the storyline just to finish the game." During the 90s, most of the kids could not afford to get gaming consoles like I did. They turned to arcade games to insert their coins. I played beat-em-up games to maximize my time. Not to mention, there were frequent brownouts, so it was hard to play video games. I only started to play JRPGs when I got my Game Boy Advance SP, where I played Fire Emblem Sacred Stones and Riviera The Promised Land. Raymond Castro, RGCP, Antipolo. I started on the NES, but I didn't remember JRPGs being available at the time. When Game Boy was out, I really loved the Zelda game Link's Awakening, so I searched for other games like it. Pokemon Yellow being the closest one that I discovered. Those were my first JRPGs. But the genre got really big during the PS1 days. Squaresoft was the JRPG king back then. Rain Holero, RGCP, Taytay. The Philippines was able to enjoy these localized games as well. Albeit, to access these games, we had to be creative. The rental shops utilized the UFO Superdrive in their Super Famicom and Super NES. Basic functions included copying the game content, game saving, and cheat code applications. Siegfried Hans adds more. You use a microdisc to save your game. There is a slot on the side, but some UFOs have the slot in the front. There were no saving capabilities before, so you needed that. Our rival rental shop had 8 to 10 SNES and all of them had UFO units, so their place had full of people lined up. Robert June adds, SNES days were great because JRPGs boomed back then. Even we guessed the Japanese text by trying to study hiragana and katakana to read the games and item stubs. Bahamut Lagoon, Final Fantasy 2 and 3, Lufia 2 Rise of the Sinistrals, Chrono Trigger, and Robotech were some of the best games I played. I would like to add the use of the UFO disc where you use a diskette. I was playing JRPGs before the PS1 became famous. Rentals as well. About 25 pesos per hour. They use super UFO units. I got my own diskette to save my own games. Breath of Fire, Breath of Fire 2, Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were games I would always play, and of course, my favorite game of all time, Chrono Trigger. I was such a regular customer that the shop owner knew me so well enough that he made me watch his shop. Of course, he would let me play for free. Hector Anunciacion, RGCP, Laguna. In the Electronic Entertainment Expo 1995, Las Vegas, Sony dropped their bombshell with the PlayStation's launch price. The PlayStation sold over 100 million units, overtaking Nintendo's N64 and Sega's Saturn. Before there was internet in the Philippines, we got all of our gaming information from monthly gaming magazines. Regardless of the gaming articles, they overhyped the PlayStation and its library of games to everyone. One game in particular that revolutionized the JRPG genre forever. It was Squaresoft's Final Fantasy VII, released on January 7, 1997. There were no internet guides or walkthroughs back then, at least for me. Mostly just exploring and just asking people about the secrets and other stuff they discovered, like bugs and glitches. Of course, there will always be those rumors of getting this character and losing that character. Robert June Ilo Robilios, RGCP, Caloocan.
Know what that is, don't you? That's the new Sony PlayStation. Oh, nicey nice, Mistress Sophia. May I have one, please? No.
The year was 1998. I was a sophomore in high school. Sony already released the PlayStation 3 years prior. It became such a huge commercial and critical success that even surpassed the Nintendo 64 and Sega Saturn. I was so enticed to play the new system that I made sure that I had enough cash to burn to go to the rental shops that had it. The PlayStation did not disappoint. My first console was the Nintendo Famicom. My second was the Sega Mega Drive. And I wanted the Sony PlayStation to be my third. As part of my father's reparations for his 10-year absence, he bought our first PlayStation. With the CD technology, RPG developers like Atlus, Bandai, Enix, and Squaresoft had more room to work with.
For their next game, Square lays the foundation for a game unlike any other. but their path will take them away from the company that had first helped them become a success.
自分たちが作りたいものを
As a software provider of great content and games, to meet the consumer demand, it requires a lot of investment and time.
FF シリーズという
For Final Fantasy VI, we expanded, we opened some doors. And in order to keep on doing that with the next installment, we as a development team wanted to obviously make it visually more advanced. And I think it was only going to work for us if we went with the hardware that had more capacity for us.
After Final Fantasy VI came out, everyone assumed that Square would move on to the Nintendo 64. In fact, Square released a graphical demo using the Final Fantasy VI characters. This graphical test was preparation for developing Final Fantasy VII. When Square did announce Final Fantasy VII, it wasn't for the Nintendo 64. It was for the Sony PlayStation.
Square stuns the game world and strikes an unexpected alliance with Sony. A new game is planned, one that will finally achieve the movie-like game quality the previous incarnations have been building towards.
My brother was more interested on Final Fantasy VII, and later on, Final Fantasy VIII, after being influenced by gaming magazines and his classmates who played them. While I was enjoying the rest of our games, I was left in awe watching him play Final Fantasy VII. Sometimes I didn't care that I could not get my turn playing the system, as Final Fantasy VII was a single-player game. I just enjoyed watching him play as I was trying to patch the complicated storyline. During the 16-bit era, fighting games were popular in my area until the 32-bit era, PS1 era. When I got my PS1, among the first games that I had was Breath of Fire 3. This started my RPG adventure. Then I told my local rental shop about RPGs, Final Fantasy VII in particular. So they got the game and their customers started to play RPGs since then. Carlo Rave Maala, RGCP, Batangas. My opinion is simple. It was hard to perfectly pirate the JRPGs of the 3rd and the 4th generation consoles. They had difficulties with the battery backup save feature that was very important for JRPGs. When these people arrived in the Philippine market, they basically taught us not to play these games because of the inability to save your progress. It was frustrating. Even the bootleg cartridges would usually cost 500 to 2,000 pesos. But the advent of the PS memory card changed that forever, despite being not perfect because it was prone to losing data. Long story short, that's the way it was. Final Fantasy VII changed all that. Ronel Chua Lusares, RGCP, Cebu. During the SNES and Game Boy Advance days, Pokemon and Mega Man were my go-to games and other platformers. When I saw someone playing Final Fantasy VII in our rental shop, it intrigued me. Let's be honest, most of the Filipino gamers go to rental shops during the PlayStation era. We did not trouble ourselves to endure the JRPG's long playtime. By the time I could afford the PS1, the PS2 hit the market. Nico Buenaventura, RGCP, Cavite. While I was watching some anime, I thought I should get something like that game. Christmas season of 1998, I happened to stumble on a certain game inside a video game retail shop. It was Tales of Destiny, released by Namco on September 30, 1998. I asked the salesperson to test it for me, and I was smiling from ear to ear. The opening animation was enough for me to buy the game. Testing the gameplay for the first time was just icing on the cake for me. It was a video game with anime-designed characters and anime-driven plotline. Sony and Namco were able to hit two of my buttons: video gaming and Japanese animation. My brother found his genre in Final Fantasy, while I found mine with the Tales series. It was Japanese role-playing games from here on out, and everything else is just filler. And finally, The genre became popular with Filipino gamers since then.
And that concludes my video editorial on how the 90s influenced my appreciation of the JRPG genre. I would like to leave a shout out and thank you to my comrades at RGCP for accommodating my research on this subject matter. As a disclaimer, I only asked them about their opinions in this particular subject. The group itself did not ask me to promote them or endorse them, but I would love to anyway. If you are a retro gamer in the Philippines or just someone who wants to do some game hunting in the Philippines, then you should check out their Facebook page. Who knows, maybe they have what you're looking for. You might be surprised on the stuff that you will find and the prices that they offer. Thank you guys once again for staying all the way to the very end of this video. If you have a topic that you want to discuss, thoughts or opinions, just jot them down below the comment section. And kindly leave a like, link, and subscribe to this channel. Oh, and don't forget to hit the notification for more future content. See you guys soon on the next video. Bye-bye.